welcome to March. It's March 5th. It is Wednesday. It has been a very eventful week here in the United States, not in my house. Everything's very much the same here. I just made some sourdough discard crackers, but this time instead of using like Italian herbs, I tried it with cinnamon, nutmeg, and a little bit of allspice. You want another one? It's literally just sourdough discard, a little bit of oil, butter. I used peanut oil this time. And then I added a little bit of sugar and some salt. So then you just spread it out really thin and bake it until it gets crispy and you got crackers. But it's planting season, so we gotta get to planting. And then also, I have chickens. If you watched any video, I think I've talked about my chickens all the time. I love my chickens. We have a dozen chickens, 2 roosters, 10 laying hens. But with my dozen chickens, I get about 8 eggs a day at least. So I looked at Sam's and I was looking at because we always buy in bulk, I looked at the 15 dozen box because that's what, before we had chickens, we would usually buy that. Because me and my boys, we eat about 5 dozen eggs a day. Or not 5 dozen eggs. We eat 5 eggs a day in the morning at a bare minimum. So that doesn't include any baking, any extra eggs, breakfast for dinner, anything like that. No cookies, no nothing. So it's just like what me and my boys eat for the morning. To do that, we'd have to get that 15 dozen box, and it was $75. $75. That would last us the whole month, but that's basically we'd be eating about $75 worth of eggs a month. It comes out to about like $4.50 a dozen, a little bit. So we did the math on how much it costs us to have our dozen chickens, which gives us way more than our 5 eggs a day. I have plenty to do baking or anything else. I could make friggin' quiches every single day if I wanted to. And it cost us about $44 for the feed and everything for our chickens. It has never been such a disparagement. I'm sure there have been times, I think in like 2022 when the eggs were really expensive, when it was more expensive to buy eggs than it was to have chickens. But the majority of the time it is like not way more expensive, but more expensive to have and own and raise chickens than it is to just go buy eggs. I mean, because I always say, like, if you were to buy the equivalent of what we're getting here, we're getting pasture-raised organic eggs. So that's always been like $5, $6 a dozen. So when you go buy eggs from like your local egg dealer, somebody in your neighborhood who has chickens, they're usually about $5 a dozen, $4 or $5 a dozen. Where at Walmart, if you go just get the plain Jane regular eggs, it's like $2 a dozen. Right now, it is insane. And I have a hard time believing that it's entirely because of the bird flu, because that's what they said in 2022. And then it came out later that it was just price gouging and inflation. There was the bird flu that did wipe out a lot of birds. And when it comes to eggs, it's harder to replenish like egg laying hens than it is to replenish meat birds, because it only takes 8 weeks to go from a day old chick to fully grown meat bird. That's 8 weeks, that's 2 months. For hens, it takes anywhere from like 6 to 8 months for it to go from a day old chick just hatched to actually getting eggs. That's quite a big difference. So if you were to lose a lot of hens and you start with chicks again, then you're gonna have a big gap between you before you start getting eggs again. So like I get it, but like I don't trust it fully, but I'm not going full conspiracy that it's just price gouging. But I do feel like in a really weird position right now, being someone who does have chickens and does have this access to something that I think is a staple in the pantry and in the kitchen, especially here in America. And I think in the majority of the world uses eggs for just about everything, whether it be baking, whether it be desserts, whether it be sweet, savory, whatever, like whether you only eat them for breakfast or whatever. Like eggs is like flour, eggs, sugar, milk, protein of some kind, right? They're staples. They should be so basic and they should be so accessible. Like that's what should be the cheap thing, right? It's the pre-made stuff, the easy stuff that should be more expensive, because there's that, convenience factor that adds on to the price. And so like, I feel like I'm in this weird position of someone who owns chickens and has eggs. I feel like this obligation to share them, like I've never sold my eggs before. I do have in-laws that live fairly close and we do give them eggs every so often. And then I also have my mom who lives a little bit further away. So it's not like she can just stop by every single week and get some eggs. What are you doing? My dogs. Like calling them up. It's like this community obligation or this familial obligation of like, I have them. I am paying way less, and obviously I have some to spare. Like there is this kind of sense of like, well, I should start glassing them, and that's like where you use like a sodium or like a citric something, and you put them in like a citric solution, and it basically just keeps the eggs fresh and shelf stable without having to put them in the fridge. And freezing eggs is kind of like a toss up, you know, but it's like, I feel this kind of weird, like feeling of like, there is this kind of sense of like ominous doom a little bit, but I try to push that down because I know that that's kind of being inflated by my anxiety, but I feel this kind of obligation, you know, and so it's like because chick season isn't here yet. Usually they start around Easter, right, where you can get them at the Tractor Supply or at the local feed store or whatever. So it's like, I want to get more chickens. I was planning on getting more chickens, but I was only going to get like 6, maybe 6. It's still been a really big learning curve. Gosh, there's so many birds. I'm making more sourdough, but today I'm making 2 different loaves because I had a lot of very bubbly starter. So I found this on Facebook and I printed it out, basic sourdough recipe. It just says flour. Now my other recipe called for bread flour, so I think I used bread flour. So with this one, I've got one with just all-purpose flour and then one with all-purpose wheat flour. So because here are my flours. I've got this big bag. I had my husband go to the store and I said I need unbleached flour for my sourdough starter because I think that's why it didn't work. And this is what I've been using for my sourdough starter, unbleached bread flour, and it's been working fantastically. This is my sourdough starter after using it. Beautiful, still bubbly, still lovely, still gorgeous. He also got all-purpose enriched bleach wheat flour. Not what I asked at all, but I wanted something like this. And then we've got this in a big bucket outside in the garage of all-purpose flour. Look at all the robins. So both of those might not work because that's not bread flour. And from my understanding, bread flour has like a higher protein in comparison to gluten. So like the different types of flours, it's the amount of protein and gluten in the flour itself. So we'll see. That's why I'm doing 2, because I want to see how this turns out. I'm doing everything exactly the same recipe, same everything else, stretch and folds and all of that. And we'll see how it goes. So another thing that I've been doing is I started querying agents. I'm using Query Tracker. I have been working on writing. Anyway, so I've been querying agents, and the feeling that I'm having right now is, what am I doing? What am I doing? I should not be doing this. I feel like I'm trying to audition for a play that I didn't read the script for. I'm not prepared, imposter syndrome, that sort of thing, right? So if you don't know, I've always wanted to be a writer. I've always wanted to I love creating. I love just creating in general. I like my favorite type of painting is watercolor painting, but I really, really enjoyed oil, and I do enjoy acrylic as well. And gouache is okay. I think gouache is on the bottom of the tier list for me. But it's like, I like creating with all mediums. I mean, in college, I took a glass blowing class. That was really fun, but that was just, I was not cut out for it. Like using the kilns and the heat and glass is so much heavier than you think it's gonna be when it's molten. Like you're looking, like I'm watching the professor just, what?
This is a reminder. Do a stretch and fold.
Oh, okay, I gotta go. Just a stretch and folds for my 2 doughs. We'll see how it's going. There is no noticeable difference in either of the doughs just yet. So, I had to let the dogs out. So I have tons of different stories, tons of different series or books or whatever that I've always liked to work on characters and character design and create the stories and everything like that. But early last year, 2024, was when I had my thyroid thing happen. And I don't want to say like I was like, oh my gosh, I had like my life flash before my eyes, and so I decided to be a writer. But apples on the front porch. And there was a little bit of that. It was a little bit like, why not? Why am I not doing that? You know? So I really kind of put like full tilt into it. I was intending on it just being 1 book, but that 1 book was sitting at 140,000 words already. And so I wrote the 2nd book, and then I have the 3rd book planned out, but I haven't written it yet because I wanted to make sure that the first one was as perfect as it possibly can be. And as I'm going back and rereading it, and I was like, well, how do I even query? So I was like, I'm at a point where I could potentially query agents. So why don't I just go ahead and do that? I did it kind of just to get the novelty of it away. and to kind of get like, once you've done it once. So I think that the first book could stand alone on its own. And I think that it is good enough to query agents. I've got to have that sort of like delusion a little bit, you know, because I don't want to downplay it, because eventually I want people to read it. But here's the feeling that I'm feeling right now, right? The first book is sitting at a really heavy 140,000 words. Now, books are normally, like a novel is usually around 100,000. Anywhere from like 80 to like 120 is like the big range. So that's quite a lot of words. That's a lot of words that needs to not be in there. And I'm really struggling to get rid of it. And I'm like, well, okay, maybe I've got 2 books worth that I could just split it up. But I'm having a really hard time finding a satisfying place to end it, a satisfying place to separate it, because I want something to have happened in the first book, something that you can, you know, be like, oh, what did they achieve? What did the characters achieve? What was the story that was told in the first book? Each book, like, you know, in the sort of like sequential storytelling of like a show that's sort of like Grey's Anatomy to a certain extent, but like House or The Mandalorian. Those are the shows that come off my head, but there's plenty of it where it's just like any sort of law show is usually like that, where you usually throughout the season, you'll have an overarching arc. That's the series. There's like throughout the season, the series. So the series of itself will have one large story, right? So let's take Supernatural, for instance. Supernatural, the overarching story was like they were trying to find out who had killed their mom, right? They were hunting the demon that had killed their mom, right? Throughout the first season, they're trying to find their dad, because their dad went on a hunting trip and he hasn't been home in a few days. If you can tell, I spent a lot of time on Tumblr in the early 2010s anyway. And each individual episode has this kind of a mystery that is then wrapped up in a bow and solved, right? Each individual thing has a thing that is satisfying. So it's like, I am of the persuasion and of the belief that even if you have a longer series of books, like let's just say it's like an 8-book series, right? Each book should have its own kind of individual plot that is then satisfied, right? So think of Harry Potter, for instance. There is the overarching series plot of Harry Potter going up against Tom Riddle, Lord Voldemort. I couldn't think of Voldemort. Going up against Voldemort and those sorts of things. But each book, he deals with the Sorcerer's Stone, and then that's completed. The second one, he deals with the Chamber of Secrets, and then that's like tied up in a bow. There's a satisfying ending to each one, but you're still left with the idea of like, oh, okay, what happens next? Surely this isn't the end of Harry Potter's story, you know? So that's kind of what I'm dealing with, is I'm trying to find what is the story, what is the satisfying thing. I have a story that's told. It's just to get from point A to point B and to get that satisfying ending. There are some things that I want to happen, and it's like, do I remove some of those things? But to me, as the author, they feel important, but are they important? And I'm having trouble stepping back and seeing, is it really important? If the reader did not see this, because I already know everything, right? So it's hard to come at it like, whoa, well, are we really missing out on something, right? Because I know, because I've seen the story with these scenes in it, right? And I'm like, oh, I can't get rid of that. It's so important. So it does this, it does that, it does this. But it's like the readers, as readers, we don't know what we don't know, like in a book, it started off as 200,000 words, and then you take out a whole bunch of scenes. Like when you watch a movie, even, you don't know the deleted scenes until you watch the deleted scenes, and you know what you might have been missing out on. That's where I'm coming from. That's what I'm dealing with right now. And a part of me is tempted to take a break from this current project and go and write something, taking what I've learned from writing this current series and going and writing a smaller standalone novel, incomplete, not a series, just one single novel, and going from there, and just kind of taking a break and then coming back to this. And when I say it out loud, I'm really tempted to do that. So we will see. Anyway, when do I gotta do a stretch and fold? I got 15 minutes. I'm making soup. It's cold.